Today, we're going to get right into the core philosophy of the Japanese spiritual movement, Happy Science, and we're going straight to the source, a really important speech its founder gave way back in March of 1989, where he basically laid out his entire vision for the world.
And what a vision it was. I mean, by the time he gave this speech, the movement had only held its first public lecture just 2 years before. But already, they were pulling in massive crowds. We're talking 5,000 people in a single room. Just think about that for a second.
So you have to ask, right? How did they do that? What was the secret sauce? What kind of wild marketing plan did they have to get that kind of explosive growth in just 24 months? Well, the answer is definitely not what you'd expect.
That's right. Believe it or not, the founder reveals in this speech that his strategy was completely counterintuitive. He actually tried to slow down growth. He made it so that potential members had to read more than 10 of his books before they could even be considered for membership. And this wasn't just some gimmick. It was born from his mission to completely reform the spiritual world.
See, this deliberate gatekeeping wasn't about creating some kind of exclusive club. Nope, it was part of a much bigger plan to fix what he saw as a seriously flawed spiritual and religious landscape in Japan at the time.
He doesn't mince words about it either. He had this deep personal dislike for the state of things. He felt the existing spiritual scene was kind of shallow, super commercialized, just low quality. And he basically said, I'm not doing this kind of work in that kind of atmosphere.
So he positioned Happy Science not as just another group, but as a seriously high-quality alternative. He even called it a graduate school for life. That was a direct challenge to what he thought of as the elementary school level spirituality being offered everywhere else.
And this is the crucial point right here. He believed you couldn't create real change by just, writing critical articles and complaining from the sidelines. No, he believed it had to come from building something so undeniably better in substance, in quality, that it would literally force the entire spiritual world to raise its game.
Okay, so if that's the why, what's the how? How do you build this superior model? Well, the answer he gives isn't a new set of rules or commandments. It's a fundamental, even radical shift in how you see the world.
He introduces this amazing analogy to make a really abstract idea feel real. He calls it the second floor perspective. So imagine you're in a theater. He says most of us live our lives on the first floor, right there in the orchestra seats, up close. He argues that we need to learn how to see everything from the second floor, from the balcony. From the first floor, he explains, the speaker on stage, which was him in this case, looks really important, larger than life. But from the second floor, suddenly he looks small, kind of distant, just one part of a much bigger picture. And that simple shift in where you're sitting changes absolutely everything.
Now, adopting this second floor view, he argues, isn't just some neat mental trick. It becomes a brand new lens that fundamentally changes how you interpret, well, literally everything in your life.
All of a sudden, you're not just appreciating art or music or books for how they look or sound. You start to evaluate them, along with big things like politics and even your own personal dramas, from this higher spiritual viewpoint. You start to see what he calls their true nature.
He gives a really specific example here. He claims that if you listen to Mozart's final piece from this perspective, you can actually perceive the composer's spiritual state right at the moment of his death. It's not about music theory anymore. It's about spiritual perception.
And he does the same thing with literature. He looks at Shakespeare's Hamlet and argues that, most literary experts are totally missing the point. From the second floor, he says, it's obvious that Shakespeare had this deep understanding of the afterlife, of the spiritual laws that govern things like prayer.
He even extends this analysis to the entire global stage. He presents huge ideologies like capitalism and communism, not as good versus evil, but as two arguments happening on the first floor. They're both flawed attempts to reach a noble goal, and the conflict between them can only really be understood and resolved by moving up to that second floor viewpoint.
Okay, so that's all the big stuff. Art, politics, history. But what about the small stuff? What about us? How does this lofty second floor perspective help with the messy, emotional, first floor problems that we all face every single day?
To answer that, he shares a surprisingly honest personal story. Before all his spiritual work, he was just a regular guy at a trading company. He had crushes, attachments. But then he spent a year working in New York, totally immersed in a different culture. When he came back to Japan, he found that all his old attachments had just disappeared. They were gone.
And the takeaway here is really profound. He didn't try to break the attachment with willpower. The change in his physical and cultural perspective, his own little second-floor experience, did it for him, automatically. He's suggesting that the exact same principle can help you overcome any obsession, whether it's about romance or your career or status.
So this brings us to the final and most practical part of all this. How does a person actually cultivate this second-floor perspective as a daily discipline? What do you do?
Well, it all boils down to one core practice he calls the quest for the right mind. He describes it as this constant, moment-to-moment checking in with your own thoughts. You notice when the needle of your mind starts pointing toward negativity, what he calls a hellish direction, and you consciously steer it back toward a positive or heavenly one.
The key analogy he uses here is that your mind is the rudder of a ship. You're not just a victim of the waves of fate. You are the captain. Every single moment, you are the one at the helm, actively steering yourself toward the port of happiness or, toward the rocks of misery.
And that leaves us with this final, really provocative thought from his speech. It's a complete rejection of being a victim and a radical call for personal responsibility. The core message is that our inner state isn't something that just happens to us. It's a direct result of the choices we make, thought by thought, moment by moment. A pretty challenging idea to end on.